Honorable members of the tribunal, dear colleagues, good evening everyone. I am Abdullah Munjid and I am here on behalf of my client, Drone IPLC. I will present the claimant from the merit side, alongside with my co-counsel Zainab Amr will present the claimant from the procedural side. Members of tribunal, before I discuss my submissions, I would like to paint a big picture about the case at hand. At first, the parties concluded a contract for the sale of 6 drones from the claimant's top model, Kestrel I 2010, at the time of concluded of the parties' contract. When the dispute arose, members of the tribunal, and when the respondent intended to avoid the contract, the respondent relying on its domestic law to avoid the parties' contract, and alleged that the CISG could not apply since from the respondent's view there is a contract for the sale of aircraft which the CISG excluded it. And contrary to these allegations, members of tribunal, and in order to answer your concerns regarding this pleading, I would like to discuss two submissions today. The first one, that the CISG could apply on the case at hand, and the second one, that in case the CISG apply, the respondent could not rely on its domestic law to avoid the parties' contract. Members of tribunal, I will start with my first submission, that the CISG could apply on the case at hand. Like what I stated above, members of tribunal, that the reason of this question is the respondent's allegation that we have here a contract for the sale of aircraft which the CISG excluded it in Article 2, Paragraph E. And contrary to these allegations, members of tribunal, the CISG could apply, and I will want to discuss two main points here. The first one, that the drones in our case does not meet the reasons why the CISG excluded aircraft from its scope of application. And the second point, that the features of our drones prove that it is not a type of aircraft. Members of tribunal, I will start with my first point, that the drones, and specifically the drones in our case, does not meet the reasons why the CISG excluded aircraft from its scope of application. By relying on the history of the CISG, members of tribunal, and exactly the history of Article 2, Paragraph E from the CISG, we could find that there are two reasons why the CISG excluded aircraft from its scope of application. And I want to quote from Professor Samson, as well as Fritz Anderlin and Rotigo and Frank Sovimer, stated that there are two reasons why the CISG excluded aircraft from its scope of application. The first reason, that it is the registration issue, and the second one, that the position of the aircraft regarding movable or non-movable of the aircrafts. Members of tribunal, the drones in our case does not meet those two reasons, the registration issue and the movable and non-movable goods. Regarding the registration issue, members of tribunal, the drones in our case does not register, and there was no any requirement to register it under the law of respondent's country, which is Equatoriana. If I may direct the attention of the tribunal to record 36 from the case, which is the respondent's exhibit 5, the Aviation Safety Act of the respondent's country Equatoriana. And if the tribunal see Article 10, the registration, and I will read to the tribunal, stated that any aircraft owned or operated by a private entity in the territory of Equatoriana shall be registered as the aircraft registry. Here it's clear, members of the tribunal, that only the drones which owned by a private company should be registered, while the drones which owned by a private company owned by a state or a state company should not be registered. And the company in our case is a private company owned by a state. If the tribunal could move with me to record 4 from the case, which is the notice of arbitration of my client. The second paragraph stated that Equatoriana Geoscience Ltd is a private company entirely owned by the Minister of Natural Resources and Development of Equatoriana. Here, members of tribunal, we have a private company owned by state, which then the drones in our case should not be registered, and then the first requirements is not exist. Moving to the second requirements, members of the tribunal, which is that the aircraft in many legislative or legal state considered as immovable goods, while the drones in our case should be considered as movable goods, and then the CISG could deal with it, since the CISG only deal with the sale of movable goods, members of the tribunal. I would like to quote from Professor John Pyatt stated that the regulation which apply to movable property do not apply to aircraft. In spite of aircraft being movable property, their legal status differ in many respects from that of ordinary movables. Here, the countries consider the aircraft as ordinary type of movable goods, while the drones in our case should not be considered as a territory or a specific ordinary type of movable goods, since the drones in our case it's only for local use. I want from the tribunal to move with me to record 10 from the case, which is the claimant exhibit 2, the purchase and supply agreements of the parties. And if the tribunal see paragraph 2, the second line, the last 4 words stated that to explore and exploit the nature resources located in the northern provinces. Here, members of the tribunal, the purpose of the respondents from buying the claimant's drones is only for local use, for the exploration in the north part from the country. It's not for travel from one place to another or to carrying a human or cargo. It's only for exploration and surveillance of the earth. Thus, it should not have a nationality, and then it should not have considered as a territory or a specific type of movable goods. It's only just a movable goods, members of the tribunal, and then the CISG could apply on it. If the tribunal does not have any further question regarding my first submission, I would like to move to my second submission, please. Okay, thank you, members of tribunal. And moving to my second submission, that in case that the tribunal see that the CISG could apply, the respondent could not rely on its domestic law to avoid the parties' contract. Members of the tribunal, the respondents in the case at hand, relying on the facts that allege that the claimants constitute a misrepresentation in the statements, and then the respondents have the right to avoid the contract relying on its domestic law. Members of the tribunal, at first regarded the misrepresentation. This misrepresentation, the respondents alleged that since the respondents ordered from the claimants a state of the art products of the claimant, and then when the parties concluded the contract and the claimants and then the respondents found that the claimants have a newest model more than Kestrel I 2010, which is Hawk I 2020, and then the respondents alleged that there is a misrepresentation. In contrary to that, members of the tribunal, there is no misrepresentation, and even if if there was a misrepresentation, it should be as well settled by the law of the CISG, members of the tribunal. And I want to discuss two main points here as well. The first point, members of the tribunal, that the alleged dispute from the respondents should not be considered as a misrepresentation, but instead should be considered as a conformity issue. And the second point, that even if the tribunal see that the alleged dispute is as a misrepresentation, the CISG still apply on the case at hand. Regarding my first point, members of the tribunal, that the alleged dispute in the case at hand from the respondent should not be considered as a misrepresentation, but instead should be considered as a conformity issue. At first, members of the tribunal, we should know what is the definition of the misrepresentation and the definition of the conformity. Regarding the definition of the misrepresentation, members of the tribunal, the misrepresentation means a false statement made by the parties. in the facts relating to the parties' contract, while the conformities members of tribunal is defined in the CISG in Article 35. If the tribunal let me to read it to you. Article 35 from the CISG, paragraph 1 stated that the seller must deliver goods which are of the quality, quantity, and description required by the Contracts Act, which are contained or packaged in the manner required by the contract. Members of the tribunal, here we have in the case at hand, we have a conformity issue, not a misrepresentation issue like what the respondents alleged. The respondent alleged that since the respondents ordered from the claimants a state of the arts products of their claimants, and then the claimants have a new model more than the Hawkeye 2010, then the respondents have the right to avoid the contracts, and the respondents consider this as a misrepresentation. But the meaning of the state of the arts, members of tribunal, is mean the top model or the newest model. And we know that the top model and the newest model at the time of concluded of the parties contract was the Kestrel I 2010. Here the newest model should be considered as a description, members of tribunal. It's not a false statement. It's only a description, like what we state, a yellow car or a blue car. It's a description of the car, and here it is a description of the products which the claimants sell to the respondents. And the respondents as well as admitted that this is a description, members of tribunal. If the tribunal, just a second. If the tribunal move with me to record it, when from the case, the claimant exhibit 8, which is the letter when the respondents terminated the parties contract, and if the tribunal see paragraph 3, the third line in the middle stated that Mr. Bolucci, who had described it as a drawn eye latest model or top model. Here the respondent admitted that the issue here is the description, and like what I stated when I read Article 35 from the CISG, stated that the description is part from the conformity, members of tribunal, and then the issue here is a conformity, not a misrepresentation. And since there are Article 35 from the CISG which deal with the conformity, then this issue should be settled by the CISG, members of tribunal, and the respondent does not have the right to avoid the contract relying on its domestic law. If the tribunal does not have any further question, I would like to conclude my submission, please. Okay, members of tribunal, and in conclusion, and from all the reasons that I stated above, we respectively ask the tribunal to find that first, the CISG could apply on the case at hand, and the second, if the CISG apply, the respondent could not rely on its domestic law to avoid the parties contract. Thank you very much, members of tribunal.